So in the spring of 2024, after Dan Quinn was just hired as the new head coach of the Washington Commanders, he asked every member of his coaching staff to create a PowerPoint presentation. But this presentation, it had nothing to do with X's and O's. It had nothing to do with football. The presentation was personal. It was about their own life, the story of their childhood, their biggest successes, their biggest failures and setbacks, the family members they were closest to. And all of these points, they were accompanied with pictures. Now, the first 4 months of Dan Quinn's tenure as the coach, the head coach of the Commanders, each staff meeting started the exact same way. A coach presenting on their life. And Dan Quinn, he told the New York Times, there were tears and there was joy. This was something that was bringing their coaches together. By June, it was time for the last presentation. That was Dan Quinn himself. And now when he looks back on his first season in Washington, he credits the bond the coaching staff built through those conversations and those presentations as a huge reason for their 12-5 turnaround that season. Now, this is a great activity to do as a coaching team, and it's not an uncommon activity. I know the Buffalo Bills did it when Sean McDermott did it with his team when he took over years ago. And personal histories and presentations to share about yourself, I mean, they're becoming more common in corporate teams. I see this often. But what I love about the story is the mindset of Dan Quinn. Dan Quinn wasn't committed to building just a player culture on his team. He was committed to building the coach culture on his team. And in fact, he started first by focusing on building the coach culture of his team. Now, whether you are a coach leading a large staff like Dan Quinn, you're an athletic director or club director leading 30 to 100 coaches, or you're a head coach leading 3 to 4 paid coaches like many college program, or a high school coach with 2 to 3 volunteer assistants, or even just a youth coach with 1 or 2 other parent volunteers. The lesson is this: our responsibility as the coach, the manager, the director is to lead, not just to coordinate or direct. We have to lead other adults. And that's challenging. And today, Nate, Betsy, and I are going to unpack what gets in the way for so many of us. What are these common excuses that we're making as adults for not leading other adults? Because here's the thing, the irony is the excuses that we often make, and I'm very guilty of them, still am, but the excuses that we often make for not holding coaches accountable, not having hard conversations, not being more demanding from our coaches. It's a very, very similar excuse that our players make when we challenge them to be better leaders. Our players will say, well, who am I to challenge them? What power do I have to say something to them? And we're guilty of these very same excuses. If we want to improve our team or club culture, we must create a culture, one of support and challenge within the coaches. We've got to start to raise standards of our coaches out there, within our coaching team, within our clubs, within our athletic departments. We've got to raise the floor in coaching, and that's what we're going to unpack today. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerbun. I'm joined today by my co-host, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. The mission of this podcast is to help you to become a better leader and build a better team culture. If you'd like to learn more about our work with TOC, head on over to tocculture.com. You can subscribe to the weekly newsletter there. It's the Team Culture Toolbox. It gives you a practical tool to build your culture every week, a thought on leadership, and the notes to this and every episode of the podcast. Also, check out Betsy's blog at Betsy Butterick. That's on Substack. Nate, Betsy, I've been thinking a lot about standards for coaches, probably in my work coaching coaches and even coaching administrators, athletic directors, and some calls that I've recently done with both around some challenges they're facing within their coaching team, within their athletic department, within their club. There's been this growing frustration of our coaches really aren't necessarily meeting the standards that we would have for our coaches that we'd like to set. And yet they don't know how to set better standards. They don't know how to raise the standard of the coaches there for many reasons. One is, most coaches are volunteers or they're not paid very well, which is a barrier for some coaches or administrators. The other is this kind of fear of like, well, we don't have a lot of people lined up at the doors these days to be a coach, right? There's that limited pool to draw from, and then there's these other things you kind of see where we're afraid to like maybe set a standard here for like it's an adult, right? Like I think sometimes as adults we might find it easier to lead players than we find it to lead other adults, and maybe sometimes we think well, I shouldn't have to, right? Like they should know better. They're an adult, right? So I think there's a lot of different barriers that kind of get in the way. But I'll kind of throw this question to both of you to get us kicked off here, which is in your experience, coaching, coaches, working as a coach, where have you felt most uncomfortable or challenged in trying to lead other adults?
JP, for me, I think the biggest constraint, and I know we say this all the time with lots of different issues that come up for coaches, but when I'm thinking about developing my own staff, whether it's currently in our youth program or as a head coach, over a program, there's always this reservation for me about asking too much, or when we're talking about getting together, or let's listen to this podcast, let's look at this book, or who wants a copy of Betsy's new book. Like I want to make opportunities for our coaches to grow and to develop and to you know have their thinking challenged in some ways. That's what I'm embracing as a coach, but there just is barely enough time for them to get to practice sometimes, or watch film or finish their scouting report or whatever, because they've got, kids at home and real lives outside of the game and what have you. So I think from a practical perspective, like the capacity that a coach has, just very broadly, generally speaking, it for us, or at least for me, has been the most limiting constraint. And again, it manifests in lots of different ways. It's not necessarily resistance to growth. It really comes down to time so often. And I just haven't like held a standard or demanded, this is what we're going to do if you want to be part of this staff. And in part because, as you said, we didn't have a long line of people that were lining up at the door that wanted to be an assistant coach, or want to coach fourth grade basketball. So, you're kind of working with the willing and trying to figure out what can we do with those that we have so that we're all still trying to take a few steps forward, even if it's not as much as what I would do or would like to do in an ideal situation.
So let me pull on that a little bit more before we go over to Betsy. I'm curious, Nate. That's probably like a lot of like setting a standard as far as like, hey, preparation, learning, growth, development as a coach. How about in the situations where you see a coach maybe on your staff or a coach in a program or a club, and you're uncomfortable to the point where you'd say, That's actually below the standard I would like for our coaches," and maybe how we communicate to our players, the way that we handle a situation. And you would say, at the end of the day, I would really like to create an environment where coaches wouldn't do that, right? So a coach does something that you would say, it's below standard there. What's the big challenge for you in that situation as a leader?
Well, you know me pretty well, JP. I mean, my superpower is conflict aversion, right? So, I mean, I typically don't like those direct confrontations, especially if, all of this kind of weaves together, right? So, let's say that you're leading a staff and you've got whatever, 8 coaches. And so you make this book available and 4 coaches buy it and 2 coaches read it. And then you want to meet preseason and 7 coaches make it and 1 doesn't make it at the end, and you go over non-negotiables, and here's the baseline standards, and of like simple things like we're going to talk 5 minutes after practice just to see how things went. Or JP, if you got to take a call during practice or something on your phone, like I get it, stuff's going on, can you just step out of the gym, or like little things like that. So if you're not if we haven't spent that time, having those discussions before we're actually on the floor, then I think that makes it harder. And again, for me, it's more of a probably a personality weakness thing where I just like, is this worth the fight? And we got to figure this out. And fight's probably not even the right word, but is it worth addressing, or do we just keep moving forward? And can I address it in a different way? So
Mm.
For me, it's definitely the conflict aversion. But I think also to your point, that feels a lot different than with a player. And I think that may be
Mm.
because there's this power dynamic where your authority is very well established, coach to player. There's a built-in structure there that the coach is automatically going to give feedback for the player to get better. That's the job. We don't necessarily see it that way with our staff, where there's a, again, maybe power dynamic isn't the right word, but the same level of leadership or responsibility to lead that I feel with my players naturally maybe doesn't feel quite the same with, other adults that you're working with on your staff.
Yeah, and you beat me to the question I was going to ask you, which was like, how is that different than, you know, leading your players, right? Like, if your player pulled out the phone in practice, you'd be like, "What the hell are you doing?" Like you would have no problem addressing it. But like, I have so many coaches that have even said that, like, "Oh, assistant coach so and so is always on their phone in practice," and it drives me crazy. But they refuse to say it to the coach, and I'm like, but aren't you the leader of that, right? And yet I'm saying this because I mean I would still feel uncomfortable too. Like, what is it about that? I mean, I don't know. Maybe Betsy, you could answer the question I asked Nate for yourself, or maybe you could comment and or comment on just that what you see within coaches and that struggle.
Yeah, going back to your original question, JP, and I can only speak from an assistant coach perspective because I was never a head coach, never had the desire to be a head coach. That said, I work with a lot of head coaches at the college and professional level across sports. And what I hear from assistants and what I experienced as an assistant is related a little bit to that power dynamic of, well, who am I to tell this person with a lot more experience in the sport or who is significantly older than I am how to operate as a human? Like, who am I to do that? So there's a little bit of this imposter syndrome related to power dynamics. And then also this, what I hear a lot from head coaches, to your point of frustration with, an assistant coaches, well, I've let it go on for so long. I'm just going to have to wait to address it at our, end of season meeting as a staff, or I'm just going to have to hire a new person, someone who that's not a thing for. And it's like, no, you don't have to do that. So I think timing plays into it. I think what we've allowed up until this point as a head coach has played into it. From the assistant perspective, who am I to teach this adult how to behave or how to work well with me, given the standards they've set are important to them? I also hear a lot of, we have the conversation as a staff, but then we lack the follow through. So we sat down and we agreed, like, these are the standards. This is the experience that we want to give. Or I have an assistant who says, I met with my head coach about the fact that this is frustrating for me, and we talked about it, but then nothing changed. So another piece that I see is the intention around, okay, this is what we're going to agree on, but then there's not the follow through, or there's a lack of consistency in how that standard is upheld, which oftentimes assistants feel that should be the job of the head coach. But then, as you've already mentioned, there's a variety of reasons why a head coach may feel less capable or able to follow through on the things that they've stated very clearly are important to them. It's almost like, well, I said it once, so now we should just go do it. But we're missing part of the conversation where we talk about what does that actually look like, and how do we know if we are meeting or exceeding that standard, if we're, kind of doing the things consistently that we said were really important professionally.
It's such a weird thing for me. Like, as soon as you get a whistle, all of a sudden, like, we have no problem offering feedback live in the moment, immediate for our players. Like, they're not running hard. What are you doing? You got to work harder, right? Like, if they're like their footwork's off, like if they're late for practice, if their shirt's untucked, like we have no problem like addressing those. And yet, when it be like just that, like Nate said, like there's like, I don't feel like I have the authority here to have these conversations, even though we, like you said, Betsy, we agreed upon this. Like we said, we weren't going to have phones out in meetings. We said we were going to, like Nate said, we're going to meet for 5 minutes after every practice to debrief. I think it is really interesting for me. I'm really interested in it. Obviously I work within, not obviously, but I work as a coach within a couple coaching teams at my kids' football club here in Ireland. And then also I just took a role within our club as the coaching officer, and we've got well over 100 coaches in our club. And, I'm, building out a team to support and develop those coaches. And so it is very interesting to me about what gets in the way of us having those hard conversations, or you're not even saying hard conversations, like just leading. At the end of the day, how do we lead coaches? We're a leader. We seem to be so much more comfortable in that dynamic leading athletes. And yet it gets, for me, I think about with the adults, it's like, well, I want to be liked. And then that question I really resonate with that, Betsy, of just like, who am I? Like, that definitely comes up for me as like, well, is this really my role? Is this my responsibility? Um, and I guess I probably tend to lean towards more of like, hey, how can we co-create some standards? But there's probably, as we're talking about this, not just co-creating the standards, but like, how are we going to hold each other accountable in these moments? Like if we break these types of things, we have that conversation with our players, or it's implied enough through their experience. But a lot of people come into coaching, they don't have a lot of experience in this, of being challenged in a direct manner like that by the head coach or the boss like that. So I think it is uncomfortable for many of those reasons.
Well, and that point, JP, I hear this most frequently. It's not my job. It's not my job to teach my assistants how to be better coaches or uphold our standards. And sure, maybe it's related to the fact that they are a fellow professional, that they are an adult. It's not my job. It's not my job as an assistant to teach my head coach how to better manage their time. Like that's not part of my job description. So even backing up to, whether it is or isn't in the job description when an individual is hired as a head coach or as an assistant coach. But if it's not, I think that would be a great addition, is like part of your role as a head coach responsible for the program is not just to develop your athletes, it's also to be intentional about the development of your staff. And can we add it to the assistants? Like I had a conversation with an assistant earlier today who said something similar. It's not my job to hold my head coach accountable for these things. They're in charge of the program. The question I'd originally asked is, within your staff, who's responsible for the staff being accountable to the standards that you have for your program? And what he said is, I mean, we've never had that conversation. But the assumption is the head coach should be responsible for the accountability of the staff. When the reality is just the same within our team. Anybody, any person, if we're talking about the players, any age player, any positional player, regardless of how long they've been in the program, can choose to be responsible for the standards that we've said are important for program success, the standards that we've set to have the ideal experience together. So whether or not it's definitively your job, I think there's an opportunity, an invitation for everyone to take individual responsibility for the collective accountability to the group. And that gets into, how often are we practicing accountability conversations? And even just the whole stigma around holding each other accountable. Like for many people, Nate, that taps right into their conflict aversion. It's like, well, who am I to hold you accountable? I'm younger, I'm less experienced. Who am I to hold you accountable? What if that causes a rift in the relationship or changes the relationship in some way? I'm uncomfortable having that conversation. Yeah, no kidding, because we're not practicing it with regularity, certainly not to the level that we're practicing the skills inherent in our sport. But we can. It requires different things, but all of these things are figure outable. And that's, I think, what excites me about this conversation.
I think another dynamic, JP, is as Betsy was talking there, I'm just, thinking about my experiences over the years, and that leadership role on the staff becomes much more natural with younger, less experienced assistants. Like, when you're bringing someone in for the first time, like I think about Bill Belichick, always talk about starting guys out as the slapdicks that, get the coffee and they do the cards and they watch the film. And, like there's just an assumption there that, that's how Josh McDaniels started, right? And the assumption is he's here to learn and we're here to give him as much as he can handle. And that's how you grow in the program, right? But that's different than hiring somebody that's been a coach for 10 years or been a head coach previously, now as an assistant coach, or someone that's maybe more similar in age, where there's assumptions maybe on both sides that I know what I'm doing. He knows what he's doing or she knows what she's doing. So they don't need as much intentional guidance versus a kid right out of college that's getting their first experience. Of course, you would want to provide them with support and those conversations and expectations because they haven't done it before. So naturally you would do that. I do think there's a dynamic there that coaches are probably sensitive to.
I maybe I could be wrong in this, but my feeling in this is I totally get you. I totally agree that is our thinking as coaches. And yet I would say we're not talking about leading. We're talking about managing then. We're talking about being someone's boss, and where I feel like I have power over them And I just consider that more management and being a boss and being in charge, and I have all the authority. And I think leadership, transformational leadership, servant leadership comes in and says, how do I come in and how do I support? How do we work together? How do we co-create and build a culture together? And I think in this raising the floor, which is kind of the basic standards of what we can guarantee as coaches that we're going to provide for our athletes, you know, there can be still some co-creation. I think a lot of us in this space here, we know how to help maybe raise the ceiling. The coaches that are hungry, we know how to share podcasts and we know how to engage people, and we can start book clubs and we can do that. We can raise the ceiling. But at the end of the day, I think that our coaches out there, our athletes, we have to raise the floor. We have to raise the floor across organizations. We have to raise the floor across our coaching teams, right? There are certain behaviors that are going on. There's certain things that are happening that are, sometimes detrimental to players in the worst case scenarios. And the best case scenarios, we're not efficient as a staff. We're not prepared for practice. We're not coaching well. And so I'm not actually saying we need to raise the floor, we have to be the boss and manager and it's about our authority and our power. I'm saying, how can we come in there and raise the floor through conversations where, we say, hey, well, what do we want them to experience here? And then to have these conversations where, we are having dialogue. I think about a conversation I had recently with a coach on one of the coaching teams, and he was demonstrating some behaviors that were, in my opinion, really over-focused for the age group that are inappropriate on winning. It was like all about the winning. It was the development was at the window. And I don't think he noticed that certain things he was saying were being picked up by the players to just maybe favor the more talented players, and we're about development and the player experience. And it was just a conversation of, hey, I just noticed these things there. I'm not sure it seems like it's come across to this and me and a few others this way. I don't think that's what you intend though, is it? And that led to a fruitful conversation for me to help say, yeah, like that's not how we want to do things here. It didn't have to be like, I don't at the end of the day have a lot of power over or any power over this individual at all. But I was able to go in there and still maybe lead in a way that didn't need that power or that authority, right? He could have said like, who the heck are you, right? And I would say, I don't know. I'm just a guy here to, try to like make the experience better, I guess, we're all part of the same team here.
Well, to that point, JP, I think there is this jump like to the extreme of, okay, if I'm going to do this, then I have to put on the manager hat, or I have to micromanage, and I don't want to do that. That's not who I want to be. Or I have to be more dictatorial, I think, in like my approach. That whole idea of power over. And this was one thing that I very much valued about my coaching experience, in part because it was different than so many of the experiences of my peers at the time. The head coach that I worked with for most of my coaching career, Heidi Vandeveer, was very clear that we as assistants were people that worked with her, not for her. So even if a coach has yet to make that distinction, like these are not people who work for me, these are people who work with me. We are a staff, right? So part of it for me is a shift in perception, a shift in mindset, especially if a coach feels like, well, I don't want to be that manager. I don't want to be that authoritative kind of individual. And for me, when we talk about leaders or managers, because I have a lot of crossover in that space, is okay, instead of being that person who is exercising their power over and, maximizing their authority, can you start as a leader from a place of vulnerability, ownership, accountability? And that's why something I use regularly with clients is the 4 R's. So recognize, restate, restart, reinforce. So you've got a problem with the behavior of an assistant, to be able to say to that person, hey, like I've noticed recently that you're constantly on your phone in practice, and I recognize how frustrating that is for me. And I've never explicitly made that clear to you, and that's on me. So taking ownership first for whatever you've allowed, intentionally, unintentionally, for something, what's contributed to something existing in the way it currently does. So recognize that, take ownership for it, and then restate, set the standard again for why it's important that the behavior shift happens, and then restart. So from now on, if you need to take a phone call, I appreciate that you step outside the gym or off the pool deck in order to do that, and then reinforce. The next time you see that person, fill out your phone, say, hey, remember what we talked about? Just take it outside, right? Like you don't have to come in with the heavy. It doesn't have to be very like, I'm going to pound this into you and you have to do this or else. It can start from a very different point of modeling vulnerability, taking ownership and accountability, and then giving a new invitation in a very clear and directed way for someone to meet or exceed your standards or expectations.
Yeah, it kind of makes what you're sharing there, Betsy, makes me think about just was reading the book Tribal Leadership, and they talk about just our language and how so much of our language is important into our experience, our mindset, and they're like, I guess level 3 of tribal leadership is very focused on the power, right? Like, I told you to do this, right? You said like, this is the standard, why aren't you meeting the standard? And that, I think, feels really uncomfortable for us in coaching in that way. For some reason, it's a little bit easier to lead in that way with our players, but I really appreciated when they talk about, at stage 4 of tribal leadership, it's really not about I'm great, it's about we're great, and this is how we do things. And it's just it's that we language, and it's just, I think the more that we can use that type of language with our coaches around, hey, that's just not how we're going to do things here, or that we, and it's much more empowering. It's less authoritative. Is it authoritative or authoritarian? I always get them confused. But either way, the dictatorial, like you said, right? Like, just we're less commanding and control, and there's obviously a lot more collaboration and just continuing to work together to hold a standard. I think the other thing too, that, man, I really wish I had done more so in the past, even when I was back a high school coach, was really set the standard for and enable and ask people to hold me to a standard, right? Hey, like, and I go back to like those moments where I did start to make a change in my coaching and the way that I work on emotional regulation. The best supports for that were oftentimes my assistant coaches. And I just felt like that is not acceptable, right? And when I drop below the line on those types of things, you better call me out on it, right? And so right here, like back to your point too, Betsy, around, well, who's supposed to hold the standard in the staff? Well, I'm empowering my coaches to do that. And I think when you make that move, then you can turn around and, you can expect that they're going to probably respond a little bit differently when you go, hey, like, that's not online, that's not on standard either there. So they're going to probably be receptive to that.
Yeah, to your point, JP, I don't think that that's part of a current conversation very frequently for a head coach to say to the people that they've hired, the other adults in the room, here's how you can help hold me accountable. Or when you have an issue with what I'm doing, how I'm coaching, the way that I'm working with you as a staff, this is how I would love for you to make that known to me. And that's such a great conversation to have, because not only when you give people permission, but when you also ask for their help, and you want to talk about the collaboration, transformative leadership, like asking people to help, creating that invitation, signaling that I know there are going to be times where I make mistakes or I fall below the standard because I am human and I could really use your help. And this is how you can do it. Because even having that conversation would remove or at least mitigate some of the barriers that a lot of assistants, I'll say, feel, specifically because of the power dynamic with their head coach, or because, who am I to tell this to this person? When that person has already said, there's likely going to be situations that come up. I would love for you to help me by addressing them and making them known. And here's how you can do that. Now I've already given them the tools to enter that conversation. That conversation now feels a lot more accessible. So we've increased the frequency with which that conversation may happen. It's not a guarantee, but wow, have we done a great job at making it more possible to work together in a collaborative way, because we've had that conversation, because we've given tools and avenues for how to approach when approaching feels hard.
And JP, what that reminds me of there is just your player development plans. If we followed the same template with our assistant coaches and ourselves, sitting down and saying, what are our goals and aspirations as a coach? Where do we want to grow? What's the gap between where I am and where I'd like to be, or how I'd like to develop? And then what can we do for each other to support, or what can the rest of the staff do to support me in that process? Even that conversation and sharing that in a preseason meeting as a staff would be so impactful, and just, again, raising the floor, setting the standard that we're all here to improve. We're going to be held accountable to something, in some way. Like, there's autonomy here to decide what that growth for you is, but we're going to share that publicly, and we're going to talk about how to support each other in that. And it's not just, it's not just correction. It's not just catching people when they're not meeting standard. I think the other thing about that kind of transparency and how coaches want to grow is that you can also reinforce when you see them above the line and there's exceptional, like that was Betsy wants to get better at, coaching players one-to-one off to the side in the middle of practice and being effective. And you see her do that. And like, that was awesome. That's as good as I've seen you do, knowing that that's what she wants to grow in. That whole collaborative process, just the willingness to share a coach development plan, I think could be really powerful for staffs as well.
Yeah, I love that, Nate. Here's my big challenging question for the people who are still hesitant. Maybe you're still on the fence. I don't know if I can make really, what's my role? Who am I to do that? What's it costing us to not engage? I think so often we look at, well, what would it cost me? They could get upset with me. And I just go back to probably ask yourself if there's a moment where you're like, ooh, I'm afraid to have that conversation. Well, what would be the worst thing that could happen? Okay, they get upset with me. What would be the worst thing about that? They quit. Well, and when I often ask coaches that, I'm like, they're like, and that probably wouldn't be that bad because right now they're a massive pain in my side, right? Like it's like that they would quit, right? Like, that would be the worst case scenario. They're actually like relieved. I think that question, like, what's the worst that can happen? But I also would flip it just like, what's it costing us to not have these conversations around development? Here's one more thing too. I've taken this coaching officer role with our club, and we did it. The first thing we started with is a survey. And I asked the questions of coaches around what they enjoy, what they're not enjoying, what's one thing they'd like to change, and what's one thing we could support them within the club, within their coaching. And I have to say, out of almost 50 plus responses, the underlying message that I heard from all these coaches was, we want to be led. We want to be supported. We want to improve communication. We feel like we're in silos. And when I do athletic department surveys, which I've done over a dozen in the last 2 weeks with over a dozen clubs and athletic departments from South Africa to Canada to America to Ireland, right? This overlying theme is we want to be led. We want to be led. We want more, and not told what to do, not dictated. We want to be led. We want to be supported. So my question for you all is this right here to finish out today's conversation is, if you could give one piece of advice, practical advice for coaches or athletic directors or club administrators around leading their coaches, what's that one piece of advice you'd give them?
Well, I think for me, JP, it would just be following or providing an example of that coaching development plan. I mean, as I was thinking about that, like I've never had an administrator, an athletic director, club director, whatever, sit down, with the head coaches at a school and say, all right, guys, this year, here's how I'm trying to grow. And here's where I think I am. And here's the support that I could, here's how I'm trying to pursue that growth. And here's how you guys can support me. I've never heard of anything like that. I've been in lots of meetings where there are goals. We're going to accomplish this thing. We're going to build this schedule, but not here's how I'm trying to grow. And I think even just starting with that transparency and expectation, I'm going to be very intentional about my growth. Hey, and guess what? I got kids at home and a million other things going on, and I don't have a lot of time or disposable income either, but it's important enough for me to set that standard and model that and do it in a transparent way. I think that if you're looking for a simple first step, is maybe a place to begin.
And mine's biased. It's going to be communication based, specifically with a question. Nobody's surprised. But as we're talking, I'm picturing like, as a staff, we're meeting outside of an elevator, right? We're talking about like, this is what we want our season to be. This is, the growth and expectations and the standards. And then the doors open and the head coach gets in, and then the elevator goes up and not everyone has gotten in yet. And maybe they were inside pushing the door close button because they really just wanted to get to the next thing, understandably. And for me, if I had to give one tool, it would be conversationally asking the question, what needs to be true? Because the phrasing of that question, if I've got a coach that's out of alignment with what I want them to do professionally or a standard that I have for our staff, when I ask a question like, what needs to be true for you to not be on your phone during practice, or not check your phone during practice? The way the question is phrased, invites someone into collaborative problem solving. It names the issue without making the issue personal. It's asking for, in the way it's phrased, a solution, and it directs the conversation from the beginning in that direction without going into, like, I know you're constantly on your phone. Like, why are you doing that? Right? Like, it just lowers defensiveness from the beginning, and it signals a positive intent to get to a better place while also inviting the other person to give us information, feedback, opportunities, like possible solutions to be a collaborative part of creating the change that we want and need. So I would say that's the tool that I would offer. The perspective piece, if it's helpful in this, I was talking with my therapist about this, and she said, every time you're worried that addressing something that you need could be problematic, and we talked about a different situation, and she said, what's the fear? To your point, JP, like, what's the worst that could happen if you actually made that request? And I was like, well, blah, 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 blah. And she said, so here's what I want you to try on. She said, it's not okay, but it's going to be all right. And I was like, there's a song about that. And she mentioned the exact song, it's not okay, but it's all going to be all right. And so just to hold this idea that if it's not okay in the moment, that's also okay. And to your point, JP, it not being okay in the moment versus not being okay forever and continuing to be this frustrating thing that we haven't addressed, like, it's all going to be all right. But it first requires that we maybe do something that is uncomfortable, or cultivate some bravery and have a conversation we're not used to or confident even having, so that we can create more of what we say we really want to experience together.
I love both your suggestions. I mean, Nate, the coach development type plan, it's so interesting. I'm always talking leadership culture because my wife works at her team within Google, and just across the company wide, development plans are things that everyone does. And leaders, managers, directors are meeting with their team members frequently, biweekly, monthly, and sitting down and just reviewing. But oftentimes at the end of the quarterly review, every employee fills out, their own performance review and what are their goals, what are their aspirations, and where have they done well, and then they come in and they just coach. They just fill in the gaps. They maybe offer a few things here, but it's very empowering. And most of the time, there's not a whole lot to add. Most time people actually, when they do the work to reflect, are aware of a lot of things that you would often suggest for them to improve at or celebrate them for. So I love these things around just having conversations. And Betsy, obviously, like you said, you're great with the questions. And I think though, it's just a great way to frame, ways to have those conversations in an effective way with people there. Here's what I would give coaches, on this. One is it's a mindset, but there is also a practical action. The mindset is start to see the fact that you're actually, if you're a head coach, you lead two teams. You have your players and you have your coaches. Now, those obviously integrate, right, and overlap, but do the exact same process you would do with your team, with your coaches. And obviously, you'll modify it a little bit, but like the idea is like, what it comes down to, what are our non-negotiables? What are our standards? How are we going to build relationships and connections, right? What is that process for building this culture here? And sometimes you can do those things together. It was really cool. I was reading about Dan Quinn at the Washington Commanders, and Dan Quinn, they did the exact same culture building thing in the preseason, whether it was this year or last year, where they brought all the coaches and all the players had to get 5 pictures, and they had to tell their life story in 5 pictures. And that was what they did their entire preseason. But it was the coaches meeting with the coaches doing it, and it was the players doing it with the players. And I was like, awesome, right? The exact same culture building activity. But the thing I often see is I go do some facilitation, and all the assistant coaches like, what we're supposed to participate in this team building activity or team discussion? I'm like, yes, 100% fully. You're supposed to be fully engaged in it. And I have to almost like when I go facilitate with teams, the hardest people to get into engage are not the athletes. They're not the Gen Zers. They're not the kids these days. It's the coaches. So have a culture system and fully implement that with your staff, right? Whatever it be. And some people might say, well, I don't have the time for that. Or one college coach that I work with said today, JP, I'm pouring so much into my players. I don't have time for my staff. I'm like, but if you poured into them exponentially, right? What would happen for your team and for your players? So my big thing is, what's your culture system for your coaching team, right? And if you're an athletic director, you can do the exact same thing. How am I going to build that, right? Just the same principles and some of the same tools apply. All right, that's it for today's conversation. Now, if you want support raising the floor, raising the standards of coaching in your club, athletic department, or just your coaching team, you got to learn more about TOC Coach. Right? TOC Coach is a very powerful tool for you and your coaches. It's an online platform where your coaches can get their coach and culture certification through TOC. It's also where you can watch online courses like the Working with Playing Time course, the Sports Parents course, and others. You also get access to online resources and culture building tools to run team activities, to build culture, culture assessments. And another really, really important thing is through the entire season, through the entire year, your coaches are getting coaching. They have the weekly webinars. I host office hours. We've got other great experienced leaders out there hosting office hours and running coach development every week. And we have a very active online discussion board where coaches are posing questions and people are coming in there and making suggestions. We're having conversations around culture and leadership. To learn more about TOC Coach, head on over to tocculture.com. If you want to get TOC Coach for your entire club or school, you need to schedule a call with us. A link will be in the details of this episode. We have very affordable pricing for athletic departments and clubs, and we're also offering a free coaching culture audit. Whether you sign up for TOC Coach or not, what we do is we come in and we survey your coaches, and then we create a report that's identifying the biggest challenges and needs within your athletic program or your club program, and then we help to build you a plan to really develop your coach culture. Now, don't forget to subscribe to the TOC newsletter. We also discuss leading coaches and building out your coaches in episodes 370, 185, and 84. We discuss ways in those episodes to really practical ways to kind of lead the coaches. So we'll put the links to those episodes in the notes for the podcast on this week's podcast. So lastly, if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with others out there and leave us a 5-star review.